Thank you very much, and sort of embarrassingly generous introduction. It's a pleasure to have you as a colleague as well. Professor Piety really does do amazing work. If you get a chance to read Brandishing the First Amendment, it's excellent. Well, it's a pleasure for me to introduce the first panel because I have on the one hand a classmate from Harvard Law School. I have on the other hand a former teacher at Harvard Law School in honor of another teacher at Harvard Law School. So it's wonderful to have all of them here. And I think just sort of based on the way that we're set up now, I'll just introduce Professor Schleicher, and then afterwards I'll introduce Professor Young. Professor Schleicher is a 2004 magna cum laude graduate of Harvard Law School. He also holds an economics degree from the London School of Economics, as well as an economics degree magna cum laude from Dartmouth College. His research focuses on the intersection between political party affiliations, election law, and local lawmaking. His work has been described as creative and provocative. It has been described as bubbling over with ideas, as well as framing a research agenda for the field of election law. Professor Schleicher today is going to give us a talk that not only contextualizes and clarifies the importance of Professor Gherkin's work to the extent that it isn't already self-evident, but also in a way loyal to his wry sense of humor. He's going to show us what it means to honor an academic and her body of work. Please welcome Professor Schleicher.
Hi, everyone. So I want to start off by thanking the people from the Law Review and the unbelievably amazing Barbette and the people here at Tulsa who have really been really warm and wonderful, and I'm really glad to be here. I also want to thank Professor Gherkin, whose work brings us all here. I want to start off, though, with a confession. I've never done this before. I've never written a Festschrift article before or an article for a symposium honoring someone, and certainly have never even attended a Festschrift honoring for a Festschrift someone so relatively junior, kind of a Doogie Howser Festschrift. So ordinarily when faced with a situation like this, I go to someone who's been a mentor and friend since I was in law school, but since Heather's the honoree here, I thought that would be weird, so I did what any good academic would do. Research. I did research. I saw a few faces, some kind of wheels turning, some hamsters running, thinking, missed his deadline, pawned it off on a research assistant. Fontana said, I probably not even turned it in until the last minute. So I did research, and what I discovered is that all the best Festschrift articles take the same three-part form. And I'm going to share this three-part form with you for the academics here. Maybe it'll be useful, and hopefully it'll make my talk a success. The first section of every great Festschrift article is starts with praise. You start off with as overwhelming as possible. You call it brilliant and inspiring, and if you can turn the person's name into an adjective, you get a triple word score. This case will be easy. You'll call this section of the talk and the paper, Heather, your work is perfect, don't change a thing. Section 2, criticism. Why? Because you have to say something, otherwise it'd be a little boring, but also because you want to make clear that the person's ideas are still challenging and are going to be talked about for years to come. Call this section, actually there is one thing. The third, and this is the most important section, is whatever the problem you just identified is solvable by reference to your own work. However you take that, you find the round hole, put the square peg in it, go for it. Call this section, only thing that could make your work better, Heather, is if you just cited me a little more. With that as a model, hopefully this talk and future talks will be a success. So, let's start off with praise. There are two major themes in Heather's work. Well, there are a lot of major themes, but two I'm going to talk about. One in her election law work, and the other in her work on federalism. So, in her election law work, or election law work generally, rather, often takes a kind of common form. People in this tribe, Fernita, Guy should be here soon, we generally say, God, the world is screwed up and here's how it could be better. The screw up is that incumbents make their own laws, and so that election law is a case of what we call the foxes guarding the henhouse. And as a result of this, we say people make arguments for things like nonpartisan election administration, independent gerrymandering, districting commissions instead of partisan gerrymandering, and a whole variety of other types of solutions. The problem is this leaves something out, which is the space between the problem and the solution. We have a here, and we have a there, but we don't know how to get from here to there. And so Heather has notably called this the from here to there problem. It was clever titling too. And her answer, the answer she gives, it takes a very different form from most election law work. She argues that instead of imagining that nonpartisan or something outside of politics will create a deus ex machina solution for us, a court case or an initiative funded by one of our rich uncles or something, that instead we should come up with tools that create political incentives for incumbent officials to act a little better. There are a whole variety of these, but the idea is to create incentives for officials to be a little less venal when they're making election laws. The most notable of these is her proposal for a democracy index. The democracy index is basically to create a U.S. News and World Report ranking of states' election administration systems, a U.S. News and World Report style. If it was actually them, it would include all sorts of weird things, and who knows. But the idea here is that we create a ranking system, and what this would do, completely outside of any formal mechanism, would result in state secretaries of state, who are the main election administrators, having some pressure to act better because they wouldn't want to be last on the list. That'd be embarrassing, and it would be used in political ads against them, and so there'd be incentives to act a little better, that we should use politics to fix politics. Very, very important stuff. The other major theme inside of Heather's work is in the area of federalism. In the area of federalism, when most people talk about the benefits of federalism, they generally are talking about the benefits of autonomy, of state or local state autonomy. And the basic idea is we talk about the benefits created by allowing a diverse nation with extremely different values to not constantly fight over everything. So that'd be a kind of a short version of Feely and Rubin. You might imagine there are benefits of sorting, that we can move to different states to get different policies. And you can imagine that being closer to the states may be closer to the people, so the democracy may work better. Heather says these things are all true, but there's major other benefits to federalism that are under-discussed. The under-discussed benefits are what you might call a discourse theory, or the ways federalism makes democracy work better at all levels of government. There are two major kind of themes in this. The first is what she calls dissenting by deciding. The idea here is that some people who are losers at the national level minorities, by being able to govern institutions at lower levels of government, whether they're states or local zoning boards or juries, will have the ability to turn the tables on national majorities. And that this creates benefits for them as dissenters and for the national majorities. The benefit for them as dissenters is that they are able to say, not only this isn't just cheap talk, but we can actually show you how our differing opinion would work in practice and maybe convince you more effectively. For the national majority, you get information. You get information on how things work, and you also get information on what it feels like to be an outsider. That to the extent that kind of ordinary Federalist 10-style shifting coalitions don't work, federalism can work in creating more effective dissent. Second major theme in Heather's work on federalism is what she calls uncooperative federalism. The idea here is that there's many theories of cooperative federalism in ways in which the federal government and state governments can work together, and in Robert Shapiro's term, create concordance, that each one of them can play a note and make a beautiful symphony. Gerken argues that, in fact, actually much of what federalism works and much of the benefit comes from discordance. That, in fact, by disagreeing, that states have what she calls the power of the servant rather than the power of the master, or the power of the sovereign. The idea here is that if you, even in areas where states have no autonomy against the federal government, they can force the federal government to make them behave, make them follow the rules. And what this does is it changes the agenda at the federal level. So that when Arizona doesn't like federal immigration policy, by gumming up the works, it can force the federal government to enforce the rules against Arizona, and this will affect the national level discourse. It changes the agenda, which has kind of effects on in a cycling legislature in a Rovian sense, and it may actually change preferences. both of these sides of Professor Gerken's work are innovative and amazing. You're perfect, don't change a thing. Section 2. There is this one thing. So we might imagine, because we have 50 states and an innumerable number of local governments, actually there is a number, but it's a very large number, of a variety of sorts, that we get lots of dissenting by deciding and uncooperative federalism. However, there are reasons to think we get less of it than we might think, given our constitutional structure. We can give two basic flavors of this argument. One is generally associated with Heather's colleagues, Susan Rose Ackerman, but kind of other places too. And the basic idea is that the cost of coming up with the dissent are borne exclusively by the dissenters, but they get no property right in it. And so the benefits are felt by other people. By the theory, they're felt by the other people. And therefore, we might see underinvestment in localized dissents. So, for instance, most Americans think that in general, at least for native-born speakers, teaching high school in English is a good idea, in general. Some local community may think that teaching high school in both English and Mandarin is a good idea, given the rising economy in China. If they wanted to engage in this, they would have to develop the curriculum all on their own. And if it worked out, everyone else could benefit. They could just piggyback on that. And so they may underinvest in national dissents, or dissenting by deciding, relative to what we would expect given the institutional structure. The second major reason why we might see less dissenting by deciding and uncooperative federalism, or at least it would take a different flavor than it's suggested in Professor Gerken's work, is because we have national level mediating institutions rather than localized mediating institutions. What do I mean by that? Well, these are all representative governments, states, locals, that generally elected officials. And democracy doesn't just work on its own. It doesn't work by magic. That in fact, most of us know very little about politicians, individual politicians, and we need tools to help us. The most important of these tools, but I could go through a couple others, are political parties. If you want to vote for Congress and you move from Tulsa to Montana and you're confused and you don't know who the people are, finding out whether the candidate is a Democrat or Republican will help you a great deal. If you're pro-choice and in favor of national health care, you'll vote for the Democrat. If you're against those things, you'll vote for the Republican. Big information shortcut. But these institutions are created at the national rather than local levels. And in fact, we see, it turns out, much less localized deviation or kind of separated local parties or deviated, kind of differentiated local brands than we might imagine. So I don't have a PowerPoint or anything, but I could put up a chart that would show this to you perfectly. Unfortunate reminder, PowerPoint. The vote for state legislatures, for instance, directly tracked the percentage change in the number of state legislatures directly tracks the percentage change in Congress every year, with a small exception in the 70s, from 1950 to today. This is even more dramatic at the local level. So I grew up in New York City, and you can look at an election held actually the year later, and the percentage vote for Al Gore or George Bush directly would translate into vote for city council a year later with almost no deviation. And you could go through that as those type of examples always. What this means is that local democracy and state democracy doesn't work as well as we might think. That responsive to things over which local officials have no control. When we go to war, it affects local officials, even though it's usually local officials can't do anything about it. When the president gets unpopular because the economy is doing bad or because the bill has been passed, it will affect huge numbers of state legislatures. European social scientists call this the problem of second-order elections, but it's something to think about, just probably more generally, which is that most of what state legislatures are mostly not responsive to local preferences on local issues. And certainly most city council members are not, at least in big cities. I don't know, small cities may create a whole different set of problems, but at least in very big cities. What does this mean for dissenting by deciding and uncooperative federalism? Well, to the extent that local elections are responsive to locals' preferences on national issues and just replicate national level preferences, the kind of rich, multi-leveled, kind of multipolar dissenting by deciding that Professor Gerken imagines will happen may in fact end up just looking like another long, drawn-out version of our national political fights. That in fact, oftentimes, uncooperative federalism ends up looking just like another version of a separation of powers fight that we have and understand pretty simply. For instance, when the federal government decided to fund high-speed rail in the stimulus bill, a number of states engaged in, a year later, in uncooperative federalism in rejecting it, in rejecting this money, even though most of the money was going to come from the federal government. The federal government could have built it anyway, but it probably wouldn't have been good, and they wouldn't have had local partners, and so they kind of stopped doing it in certain places. The places where they stopped seem to have nothing to do, or the places that reject the money, with the how good an idea it was to have high-speed rail in those places. So, for instance, in Florida, which elected a Republican governor in 2010, they rejected high-speed rail money, even though everyone thought that was like the best option for high-speed rail. And in California, they didn't reject the money, despite the fact that the San Francisco to Los Angeles line will not be built until 20 and never, and will cost roughly all the money. And so what we might imagine is that instead of getting this kind of rich, multipolar, improved discourse, what we get is just another version, kind of fought out over time, of our national political bickering. I don't mean bickering to kind of demean it, because I love that stuff, but I do even do it for a living. But rather that we might see less and different dissenting by deciding on cooperative federalism than we might expect. So how could we fix this problem? Section 3. By citing me more. I actually say that, I note in this thing I sent around that was tongue-in-cheeky, because Heather is rightly well known for her generosity with younger scholars, and both in print and with her time, something that many of us here and all around the country appreciate quite a bit, and I've certainly benefited from maybe more than others, and so thanks for that. But still, you could have cited me more, and you should never be satisfied. Well, we could think about ways that we could make local democracy more responsive to local preferences, and how we could make it more different from the national level. And we could think about this across a huge number of spectrums. So one utterly brilliant scholar has made a couple of arguments on how to solve this problem. He'll remain nameless, but the idea here is that we could change election laws to kind of differentiate local parties from national ones. So one example would be that we could, in cities that have nonpartisan elections, one thing we've noticed is that executives are more responsive, or in all elections really, executives are more different from national level. That executives can differentiate themselves from national party brands far more than legislators can. So Oklahoma has had Democratic governors in the relatively recent past, maybe still does, I didn't check now, but has had, whereas the legislative vote, I imagine, again, I haven't looked into Oklahoma too much here, is more responsive to national level preferences. New York City has had Republican mayors for the last 5 elections, despite being an overwhelmingly Democratic city. If in a context of a nonpartisan election, we could take the individual level brand of the executive and turn it into a local party brand by allowing that executive to endorse candidates on the ballot. We could also change election laws to allow parties to differentiate themselves more. We could allow people to switch parties between federal and state elections by changing registration laws. We could just change ballot listings. So if we wrote on the ballot, this is really the local Democratic Party, nothing to do with the national government, or right on the ballot, it might create a differentiated brand or allow for the differentiation of brands at the local level. We could also mention non-electoral or non-formal tools. I actually think the Democracy Index is best thought of as a solution, or perhaps in part thought of as a solution, as to this type of problem. So state secretaries of state elections are largely responsible to national preferences. That if you're a Democrat, you vote for the Democratic State Secretary of State because you think that might give you the slight extra bounce in a congressional election. If you're a Republican, you go the other way. And that is true across all states, basically, that have elections for State Secretary of State. The Democracy Index is meant to introduce a local factor. So in fact, it turns out State Secretary of State, if lines are long, you don't vote against them. Because you don't know who's responsible, you have no idea who they are, you're just going to vote for the party because it's easier, and it probably correlates a little bit with your preferences on the issue. This leaves them largely unresponsive. The Democracy Index is meant to introduce responsibility by creating some kind of political pressure for them to behave better. It will give a tool to the people who do better, and kind of a weapon against those who behave badly, or as judged by local preferences. One of the great things about this fellowship and the choice of topic is that Professor Gerken's going to have a long time to help us answer these questions. We have trouble figuring out, at least I have trouble figuring out still, how we're going to get from here to federalism all the way down. And hopefully you'll be able to show the way. So thank you very much.